My name is Scott Dordick. This is the video tutorial on how to use aperture, shutter speed, and ISO to get professional looking images. Aperture is the size of the adjustable hole in the lens that the light goes through. The bigger the hole, the more light it lets in. But a larger aperture hole will also have less depth of focus, or depth of field. In this image, we are using a small aperture opening. Notice how distracting the background is. You can see how much better the image looks when we use a large aperture opening to isolate the flower from its background. The hole size of the aperture is measured in f-stops. The smaller the f number, the bigger the aperture hole. So an aperture of f1.4 is a bigger hole and will let in more light than an aperture of f22. Often, in landscape photography, you will want as much of your image as possible in sharp focus. Using a small aperture opening will give you maximum depth of focus. In this image, a large aperture opening was used, so only the background is in sharp focus. By stopping down to a smaller aperture opening, we can get the whole image in focus. Shutter speed is simply how long your camera's shutter stays open to expose your camera's film or sensor to light. A shutter speed of 8 means your shutter is open for 1/8 of a second. A shutter speed of 15 means your camera's shutter is open for a 15th of a second. If you move your camera during the time the shutter is open, your image will be blurry. A tripod or faster shutter speed will give you a sharp image. If your subject moves during the time the shutter is open, your subject will be blurry. Only a faster shutter speed will give you a sharp image if your subject is moving. Shutter speed affects how motion looks in your image. A fast shutter speed will freeze motion. I use the shutter speed of 1/500th of a second to freeze the motion of the water. And a slow shutter speed will allow motion to blur. I use the shutter speed of 1/8 of a second to allow the water to blur. An interesting effect is to pan along with a moving object, using a slow shutter speed to emphasize speed. I use the shutter speed of 1/15th of a second to allow the motion to blur. It is important when panning to keep panning through the entire exposure. When shooting where there is very little available light, such as night photography, you will need to use very long shutter speeds. I have shot at night where I have needed to use shutter speeds that are minutes long. Of course, a tripod is a must when using long shutter speeds. The basic rule for determining what shutter speed you can handhold your camera at versus using a tripod works like this. If you are using a 60mm lens, you can handhold your camera at a 60th of a second. A 100mm lens, you can handhold your camera at a 100th of a second. A 500mm lens, you can handhold your camera at a 500th of a second. There are a lot of variables, including sensor size, so practice and see what works for you. ISO is how sensitive your camera's film or sensor is to light. By using a higher ISO number, you can adjust your camera's sensor to be more sensitive to light. But this increased sensitivity comes at a price. Using higher ISOs will give you a noisier or grainier image. With most cameras, an ISO of 200 will give excellent looking results. But camera technology is constantly improving, so it is worthwhile to do a test to see how high an ISO you can use and still get excellent looking images. This chart shows the full steps of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Although the chart can be extended in both directions, it does include the settings that most of you will be using most often. Photographers call each step on the chart a stop. In regards to exposure, the relationship between aperture, shutter speed, and ISO works like this. One full stop of aperture equals one full stop of shutter speed, which equals one full stop of ISO. Let me show you. Let's say our meter gives us an exposure of an aperture of f11, a shutter speed of 1/30th of a second, and an ISO of 400. If we move the aperture one stop to the next smaller opening, we cut the light in half. Now let's put the aperture back where it was. If we adjust the shutter speed to one stop faster, we cut the light in half. Now let's put the shutter speed back where it was. If we adjust the ISO to one stop slower, we cut the light in half. Now let's put the ISO back where it was. As you can see, it doesn't matter which one we move. All the adjustments affect the image exactly the same way. This is also true if we add one stop of light. If we open the aperture one stop, you can see the image gets brighter. The amount of light has now doubled. Now let's put the aperture back to where it was. Now, we will move the shutter speed to the next slower setting. As you can see, the image looks just like it did when the aperture was opened one stop. The amount of light has doubled. Now let's put the shutter speed back where it was. The same holds true for ISO. If we move the ISO to the next larger number, the image looks exactly the same as it did when we added a stop of light with aperture or shutter speed. Now let's put the ISO back where it was. What this shows us is whether we adjust the aperture, the shutter speed, or the ISO, the image's exposure is affected exactly the same way. So if you remove a stop of light from one area, you can add the same amount of light back just by adjusting one of the other areas. For example, let's say we want to decrease our aperture size from f11 to f16 to get more of our image in focus. We will lose a stop of light, and we will have to adjust either the shutter speed one stop or just the ISO one stop to maintain the correct exposure. In practical terms, if the most important part of your image is having everything in sharp focus, use aperture priority and select a small aperture opening. If the most important part of your image is having selective focus and you want only your subject in sharp focus, then use aperture priority and select a large aperture opening. If the most important part of your image is to freeze motion, then use shutter priority mode and select a shutter speed that freezes the motion. If the most important part of your image is to have motion blur, then use the shutter priority mode and select a shutter speed that gives you the desired amount of blur. If you are shooting in dim light, you will have to decide if you want to use a low ISO, which will require slower shutter speeds in a tripod, but will give you the best image quality, or use a higher ISO so you can handhold your camera. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, or you would like to learn more about our Acritec photographic products, you can visit our website at acritec.net, or you can send me an email at info@acritec.net. Thank you.